Okay, I think this thing is working. Good evening. I hope everybody is having a good week. We are going to be in 1 Kings 19 and 20 this evening. It's a lot of territory to cover. We'll obviously cover relatively quickly. But two main chunks, we see a change in Elijah and his situation. Elijah does a lot of traveling in chapter 19, and then we'll see the passing or the beginning of the passing of the mantle of Elijah's role, maybe as Israel's prophet, to Elisha briefly at the end, and then we'll go into chapter 20, which is a lengthy chapter discussing about the wars between the northern kingdom, Samaria or Israel, and their neighboring enemies, Ben-Hadad's forces we would say of the people of Aram. Or we could say Syrians, if you wanted to, really kind of centered around the ancient city of Damascus, which is still a city today in modern-day Syria. So just a little recap. Last week we had a great victory for the forces of Yahweh, if you will, because we have this great scene at Mount Carmel where Baal is proved to be non-existent, or at least does not engage in the mind of the ancients. And in counter to that, Yahweh blasts the altar all to pieces and makes his presence known. Now, something that came of interest to me as I was preparing for tonight's lesson and thinking back on, if you've read your homework, if you're here last week and you remember to read your homework, it's very strange that after this great victory one would perceive, Elijah is afraid of Jezebel. And it's very interesting to think about that. And why was he afraid of her? Does he not have faith in the power of God? He just had it demonstrated to him. He's this mighty warrior prophet, if you will, has all these prophets of Baal put to death. And it just seems like this is put to an end. But then we come to this chapter, and Elijah is fleeing from his life and terrified, ready to throw in the towel. And so it's just a stark contrast. It made me wonder, not that in particular, but just as we talked about last week and have talked about previously in this class, we don't need to think of the Israelite people in some ways any different than their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. Is they probably believed in the existence of Baal. That they may have seen him rendered powerless by Yahweh. They may have seen Yahweh being the supreme God. But it is obvious from their history that we see spelled out in the books of the Kings that they certainly didn't mind to worship other gods, on a regular basis. And so I'm not speaking of the mind of every Israelite, but I think about them as a whole. It's absurd for us to think that they didn't believe in the existence of other gods because they're all the time chasing after them. Even sometimes when there's a good king in charge, they're still worshiping in these high places and doing things of that nature. So we, as a people today of God, are exclusively monotheistic, right? I think most of you in here, and unless some of you would surprise me, you don't believe there's any other deities other than Yahweh, other than God. Now, you certainly believe in other divine beings that serve at Yahweh's pleasure, whether you want to call them angels or seraphim or cherubim, whatever you want to call them, or part of the divine council, whatever you want to talk about that. And there's no problem with that. But you believe in one supreme God that rules over everything. And there's no such thing as Baal or Marduk or Chemosh or Molech, or Zeus or Jupiter, anything like that in there. It made me wonder, did Elijah only believe that Yahweh was the only deity, that he was the only God? And I don't know the answer to that question. Offhand, my reaction is to say, oh yeah, because he kind of makes fun of Baal. But I wonder, did he ever have fear of them, or was he an absolute monotheist? The Lord thy God is one. And so that's just a thought that I had. Now, I don't think there's anything that indicates to me that Elijah believed in the existence of other deities. One thing I would know for sure is he certainly did not believe in them to have any power in that way. That's just kind of a sidebar thought that came up in my mind just because of how Israel was surrounded by that. I would like to think that Elijah was a monotheist. And so when we come to the beginning of 19, we have Ahab the tattletale who goes back and tells Jezebel, his wife, his Phoenician wife, who re-enters the story briefly here, and then we will see her again next week in the last week of this class in the narrative about Naboth's vineyard. She'll come back into the scene, but we don't see her in chapter 20, for example. But here, at the beginning of this chapter, Ahab goes back and tells Jezebel all that has happened up at Mount Carmel and how he killed the prophets with the sword. And then so Jezebel sends a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." This is a death threat accompanied by an oath taken on her gods and a curse called upon her if she does not follow through with this. Now we know that this did not carry through. Elijah did not die in between then and the next day, but she calls down curses on herself. She's very angry, and Elijah is afraid. And he gets up and he flees for his life, and he went a great distance away. I mean, not immense distance away, but really into the southern kingdom of Judah. And so I know this map is hard to see, but our story last week left us at Mount Carmel, up off of the Jezreel Valley, and then this is where Beersheba is and where he has fled to now. And so he obviously goes and seeks refuge in a kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah, because they're not friends with Samaria or Israel. And so this is a good place to go hide outside of Jezebel's territory. Remember, previously he goes up into Jezebel's home country when he is getting away from Jezebel. But now he is moved south and gone for cover. And we're going to see that he goes from here even further south to Horeb, which is synonymous with Sinai, or the mountain that Moses gave the law, which is much further south down into the Sinai Peninsula. I don't know that we know for sure today which mountain is Mount Sinai, but there is a traditional location for that, and a monastery of St. Catherine at its feet in doing it. So he leaves, he goes a day's journey in the wilderness to the solitary broom trees down in Beersheba. He leaves a servant there, and he goes out and he sits under a broom tree. I don't have a picture of a broom tree. I'm going to assume it is a tree that people use to make ancient sweeping devices with. He asks that he might die. I mean, this is a contrast to the Elijah that we saw at the end of 19, getting rid of people, just knocking these prophets off, very, very arrogant, very, very pompous in his display there. And so he falls asleep, an angel touches him, gives up to eat, and then there's a cake, bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. This is about normal meal. And he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel comes back a second time, and he got up and ate. And he says, that went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Then he came to a cave and spent the night there. And so he has now moved south. I didn't put up a map of this up on the board, but now he's moved south into Horeb, and we have some very Moses-like things going on. We had the family feud board last week. You guys will remember that you have numbers. We're going to encounter them here in a minute of 3, 7, 12, and 40, or multiples thereof, are the most common numbers that we see referred to. But you remember that when Moses went up to Sinai initially, went up on the mountain to receive revelation from Yahweh, he is up there for 40 days and 40 nights without food. And so we know that that's physically impossible by our modern reckoning and physicians, but God can sustain someone however he wants to. And obviously, this little bit of food that's described here, when we look at that, we're like, there's no way I could survive 40 hours on that amount of food, much less 40 days and 40 nights. But again, we see something very symbolic. He's going back to that mount at Horeb, and he is going to have an encounter with Yahweh, just like Moses had an encounter with Yahweh. And then as we move through that, we see some bookends. It begins in the second part of chapter 19, verse 9. The word of the Lord comes to him and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answers, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, and the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Now, if you go right over to the end of this little passage we'll talk about here in a minute about this scene on the mountain, the Lord comes to him again and says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answers him verbatim with what he has said here. So this little story is sandwiched in between there. And this story has generated a lot of sermons that I think misinterpret this passage about God being silent and still and all those things. Generally, what we'll see here in God producing earthquakes and wind and fire and then absolute stillness is what we would call about the sovereignty of God. So thinking about this whole journey that Elijah has gone on, it is brought about by despair and fear. Perhaps this is the case because maybe Mount Carmel didn't bring about the decisive victory that Elijah had expected. We really don't know why Elijah's bravado and swagger has disappeared. You know, this ought to have been, Mount Carmel ought to have been the beginning of a revolution where Elijah and people rally behind him and all of Israel recognizes that Yahweh is God. But that's not how things work out. And even sometimes in our life, we might ride a spiritual high or a high in our lives, and it still might not bring us confidence, and something may bring us lower. But one thing is for sure, he was terrified and intimidated by the threat of Jezebel. So what that tells us is Jezebel was a powerful woman, an influential woman, and had enough people on her side to scare Elijah into really leaving the country and fleeing down to this southern kingdom. So maybe perhaps things did not work out exactly as we may have thought or anticipated them. I wish they had. I wish this had brought about a renaissance of Yahweh worship in Israel, and Ahab had changed his mind and he'd kicked Jezebel to the curb and had gone back to Yahweh worship saying, "Hey, I heard what happened up there, and man, Elijah is the man. And he's the guy to get by. I want him in my palace every day telling me what's going on and what the will of God is to tell me that." But that is simply not how things wound up working out. We see another miraculous feeding. Remember, Elijah has already had food brought to him by God. As we think about, I'm sorry, that's my mother. My mom and dad are the only breakthrough people. So I hope that's nothing serious. But I will check that out later. There's also a good chance my mom forgot that I'm at church right now. But we have a miraculous feeding. We have brought things to, ravens have brought him food. He had water from a wadi that he was drinking from. And we definitely see this idea of this Moses motif. We see this reflected in Jesus as well, as Jesus goes and spends 40 days and 40 nights without food prior to his temptation by the devil. And so you can always guess 40 in a term. I don't know if Israel is it's just irrevocable damage that has been done by really, if we think about it, centuries of idolatry that had been going on up until the time of Elijah. But it just seems like there's nothing, in his mind, at least in Elijah's mind, I am ready to die. My life is worthless. There's nobody on my side anymore. And Elijah comes out and asks him, he said, I'm gone. There's nobody else. I alone am left. I'm all alone. Obviously not, because he is going to go and ordain, if you will, Elisha to become his heir apparent. And so one would think that Elisha was a good man and a godly man. And so one of the things that we see, and we see here later on, is there were still people in Israel that still believed in Yahweh and were faithful to him and had not bowed the knee to Baal, to use biblical phrase here. But it would be easy for me to think about Israel being completely lost. And I retreat to Judah, and really Judah was no better in that scene. And I can imagine you feeling very, very alone. It makes me think about in the early days of Christianity. We talked about this in the Wednesday afternoon class today as we're studying through Peter's writings of just how small the number of Christians were and just how strange and odd and weird their religion was in their environment. We are not accustomed to that in a world where it's very hard to find anyone unless we go to some deepest, darkest places that hasn't heard of Christianity or know that it's a major worldwide religion. around the world or in our environment. It's hard to drive up and down the streets of anywhere in the Bible Belt and not pass 50 different Christian tradition and houses that people worship in. That is not the case for early Christianity. And I think about they were surrounded by idolatry. Early Christians were surrounded by a society that their normal religion, their normal way of life was very cultish and very idolatrous. And so what's the difference between that and where Elisha was? Numbered very few and enough to where Elijah think he's very alone. So I can see where he would think he was very alone. And we can also see in early Christian writings, they felt very alone in a world where their religion was not authorized. Often people will say their religion is illegal. That is a misstatement. We don't have anything that tells us in the 2nd century that Christianity was illegal, but it was unauthorized by the Roman government. We also don't have anything that tells us the Roman government issued imperial decrees to persecute Christians. But local Christians had a hard time because local magistrates and other officials were against them. And so we think about Elijah being alone. We can think about our early Christian brothers and sisters in the 1st century and 2nd century feeling very alone as well. And that's hard for us to imagine, but sometimes in our workplaces, in our lives, in our social circles, we may feel very alone as well. But God tells us you are not alone, because in 18, he says, I'm going to leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal and every mouth that has not kissed him. Obviously nobody has kissed Baal literally, because he doesn't exist. But this would mean have given him honor or given him respect or given him the due of that. And so the next thing that we see before God says this is this scene in the cave. And so we see that there's a great wind so strong that it was splitting the mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. He didn't arrive with that. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And so Elijah finally goes out. I wouldn't have gone out any earlier than this either, because I'd been scared to death. And then he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? He asks him the same question again. And what we see in this presence is these statements here are remarkable. What kind of wind have you ever seen that splits mountains and crushes rocks? I mean, that's an unimaginable supernatural force. And then an earthquake. Now, if you live back in this day and time, today we know the natural causes of earthquakes. The ancient people obviously assumed that gods were the ones who caused earthquakes. And so this is a typical way for an ancient Near Eastern deity to show his power. And then this fire, this arbitrary fire up in the mountains that goes by. And we think about all these things that explain to us again as the text of the book of Kings, and really the entire Hebrew Bible teaches us that God is sovereign over all things, over nature, over everything that exists in creation, over nations, over people, over whatever you want to choose. And that's an important thing to come across to the ancient readers, because this book wasn't written to 21st century Christians in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. It was first and foremost delivered as a historiography, a biographical history of the people of Israel, to tell them about their history of their relationship with God. It certainly is useful for Christians today to tell us exactly that. How does God's covenant relationship with people play out? And so that's easy for us to think about. But God is sovereign. And we think about that once again. For many of us that have been Christians for a while or have always believed in only one God, it's an automatic assumption that God is sovereign over all things. But keep in mind, that's not the case with the ancient audience, because everybody in Israel was an idolater, or a lot of people in Israel it was dominated by idolatry. So they obviously did not think that God was sovereign if they're going to pray to the storm god, Baal, to bring rain, or they're going to pray to Asherah for fertility, or whatever else it may wind up being, or to any of the other Canaanite or ancient gods of the Hittites or anybody else, or the Ammonites, or choose whatever you want. They obviously didn't believe that. And one of the blessings that we can see is that this message worked. Because by the time of the Second Temple Judaism and the time of Jesus Christ, idolatry was not a problem for the Jews. There is no issue that Jesus has to confront. There are issues of arrogance. There are other issues that Jesus deals with the religious aristocracy in Jerusalem, but idolatry is not one of them. They read their ancient story and they believed in it. I'm talking about observant Second Temple Jews. Were there ethnic Jews that may have converted Hellenistically to worship Greek gods? Yes, there may have been ethnic Jews that did not, that practiced idolatry. But for the religious sect of Judaism, idolatry is not an issue that we have in there. There's a lot of other issues that they had, but they have learned that God is sovereign and God is over all things. God has defeated all other gods, and God is perhaps the only God, even in the mind of those who lived in the first century, some 800 years after this time period. And so what this demonstrates, when we see nature dominated by God and moving at His will, we can know that it is sovereign. Because nobody can control nature, right? We wish we could. We wish we could make hurricanes stop and tornadoes cease, and we wish we could make it rain when we're having droughts, and there's a lot of other things that we wish we could have absolute control over. But when ancients read this, they know that this is all the power of God that we see. Now, it's not unusual for us to feel alone or defeated or challenged in our faith. And I don't have a lot of experience with that, at least in the past 14 years, because I am blessed to be immersed in among godly people, maybe except Brian. Everybody in the office is pretty godly people, and I'm pretty immersed in them, and I don't necessarily have these challenges, and I have believed in God my entire life. I have times where I have doubted certain things or been challenged ethically by things that I see God do that maybe I don't agree with or I don't understand. I have had my doubts about the validity and accuracy of the Scriptures. There's a lot of things that I have been challenged by in my life, but I'm very blessed that I don't live daily surrounded by people who are trying to push me away from God. Quite the contrary. I live and work for men and women who try to steer me in the direction, and many of you in here as well have been guides to me in that way. But there are times when we may feel alone or defeated or challenged in our faith. And I have heard Christians say that doubting your faith is a sin. I have a real issue with that, depending on what you define as doubting your faith. I understand ceasing to believe in God is obviously a sin, and obviously something that cannot be congruent with being a Christian and a Jesus follower and someone who's planning on going to heaven. It's equally congruent that I can't not do good deeds for other people and do works because I'm saved, because Jesus Christ said in Matthew 25, if I don't visit the sick and I don't visit those in prison, and I don't clothe the naked and I don't feed the hungry, I'm not going to heaven. He says that as plainly as it can be. We don't often focus on that, but sometimes we may have challenges in our life. Is God really in charge? Has God abandoned me? Is God not going to help me? Do I deserve this that I'm going through? And that's okay. And I'll tell you why it's okay, because if not, then I have to erase most of the Psalms out of the biblical text. Because even Jesus quotes from a Psalm on the cross. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so there were people that cried out to God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting this happen to me? Have you left me? Do you hate me? It's okay to do that. Otherwise, the psalmists are ungodly people, and I don't think that they are in that case. But one of the blessings that I feel that Elijah didn't have the luxury of right here is, I believe there's a reason that we are called out to assemble and fellowship together. And I believe there's a reason why the New Testament places an emphasis on that. It places more of an emphasis on fellowship than it ever does on worship. And us being together and encouraging one another and being there for one another and loving one another, love is greater than, these other things. It's the greatest thing. We talked about that today as well. 1 Corinthians 13 is not a wedding passage. It is not talking about erotic love or romantic love. It's talking about me demonstrating God and kindness and mercy and forgiveness and gentleness and help and mercy to other people. And that is something that I think is a blessing to be a part of the Lord's church. I can tell you that my family benefited from that immensely when Tracy went through breast cancer and I went through my heart surgery and initial things like that. I'll also tell you that when we lost our first child in the womb, that we had a lot of ladies that surrounded Tracy and comforted her and gave us peace and encouragement. Not everybody, we didn't announce that from the pulpit or something in that nature, but that's a very painful time. It's one of the worst memories I have ever had in my entire life. And I would let them cut my chest open 10 times more, not to have to ever go through that again. But I remember we were surrounded by those who had experienced that, been through that, and it was a comforting thing. So if you're a part of the Lord's church and you insert yourself into that fellowship, then you will enjoy those benefits. Will sometimes people disappoint you? Yes. One of my favorite things I ever heard Brother Griff say is sometimes I will disappoint you. As a human being, sometimes I may not perform up to your expectations, and I appreciate that humility in a man who, I don't ever remember him letting me down. But we are humans, and sometimes we're going to make each other angry or we'll do things, but for the most part, it's a blessing that God has called us out and been together. And to me, that helps you appreciate and have faith in God because you're not left alone. Elijah felt very alone. And so what does he do? He goes and recruits some help. This guy is driving 12 oxen. Now, why do you think there's 12, right? Man, that magic number just keeps showing up all the time. Very symbolic of the tribes of Israel. Also a man who's doing a pretty good bit of plowing, because 12 oxen is a powerful pulling tool that you would have. Also a man who knows has good animal husbandry skills, because that's a lot of animal to manage. One oxen a man cannot dominate. 12 oxen could take a man wherever they well pleased. But to be able to yoke that many animals together and coordinate them is an amazing thing that he was doing. So Elisha was doing something, and Elijah comes by and he throws his mantle over him in this very symbolic gesture of essentially recruiting Elisha. Elisha acts like it's no big deal. Oh yeah, I've been expecting this for days. This is very normal for Elijah to come by and do this. And he says, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow to you." And Elijah said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" So he returned from following. He took the yoke of oxen. This would have upset my mom and dad if I was Elisha. And he kills all of them. And he feeds the community around there. He boils their flesh, which sounds kind of gross to us, but he gave it to the people and they ate. He has burned his bridges, if you will. And it makes me think about what Jesus had to say when he says, "I'll follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to those at home." And Jesus said to him, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." I don't know if this was in Jesus' mind, but we do know there's a lot associated with Elijah and messianic prophecy and fulfillment. I don't know that, but Jesus does not allow or does not encourage to go back. And so Jesus is greater than Elijah. Jesus is greater than Elisha. The kingdom message and the importance of what he's doing is greater than what was going out that way. But Elijah recruits Elisha, and Elisha becomes his servant. Now, we're not going to see Elisha on the scene much. Now, if you want to go on reading in 2 Kings, you will see some things that will come true. When we look back in the middle of chapter 19, he tells Elijah, "Go back your way to the wilderness of Damascus," probably somewhere north of what we call the Sea of Galilee, and you will do something. You go anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You're going to see that not take place until 2 Kings. And you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. You won't see that again until 2 Kings. So we won't cover that fulfillment in here. And you will anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, and I'm going to say Abimelech, as a prophet in your place. And so whoever escapes Hazael, Jehu's going to kill him. And whoever escapes Jehu, Elisha shall kill. And so he sees, "I'll leave 7,000. Again, we have 7 multiplied by 1,000 there. And so all these, unfortunately, they won't take place in our study. So you have to go read into the book of 2 Kings to see this. Our last chapter here, not a lot theologically present there. A little bit we'll talk about, but we have the wars between, or the battles, if you will, between Ahab and Ben-Hadad, the Syrian or the Aramite. That we may look and see. And so we see this battle's taking place. We hear a little bit of trash talking here at first. When we see the first Ben-Hadad comes, this kind of gives us an idea how weak the northern kingdom had become, because Ben-Hadad comes and he lays siege to the city of Samaria, and he makes demands of Ahab, and Ahab caves into these demands. He says, "Deliver to me your silver, your gold, your wives, and your children." And he agrees to that. He says, and also, he comes back again and says, I'll tell you what, you're going to not only give me that, but my servants are going to come and they're going to search through your house and the house of your servants and lay hands on whatever pleases them and take it away. So we see that to maybe preserve peace, to escape death, to overcome the siege, Ahab is willing to make some concessions. Well, you give an inch, they'll take a mile. And so Ben-Hadad sees this as a sign of weakness, a sign that he can ask for whatever he wants to. His siege has been successful. And Ahab calls in his advisors, the elders of the land. He said, look now, this man is seeking trouble. So I did not refuse him. And they said, he's asked me these other things. And they said, do not listen or consent. And he says to the servants of Ben-Hadad, the messengers, you can, all that stuff I agreed to at first, you can have that, but the other thing I cannot do. So Ben-Hadad comes back and he swears an oath, sort of similar to, or not similar, very similar to Jezebel. The gods do to me and more also if the dust of Samaria will provide a handful for each of the people who follow me. That's some trash talking. And then we see Ahab replies and he says, the one who puts on armor should not brag like the one who takes it off. Now, we're not familiar with ancient idiom or trash talking, but that is the equivalent of saying, don't catch your chickens before they hatch. You've decided you're going to defeat us, you better be careful. That may not necessarily be true, which is a little bit of bravado on Ahab's part to say that. And so Ben-Hadad heard this message. He'd been drinking with the kings at his booth, and he tells them, essentially, saddle up, take your positions, and they take their positions against the city that they're going with. And so a prophet comes up to him. Once again, in the books of the Kings, the prophetic word is dominant, and we will see that in the last bit that we look at here. The prophet comes up to, we don't always have a name for prophets. They come up to the king Ahab of Israel and says, thus says the Lord, or Yahweh, have you seen this great multitude? Have you seen the armies of Ben-Hadad? Look, this is very surprising, right? We think Yahweh would be, I'm going to let them kill you because you're married to Jezebel and you're an idolater and you're a terrible king. But that's not the case. And we think about why is that not the case. We consider the fact that is it beneficial to Yahweh for one of his cities to fall? Meaning where Jerusalem or Samaria, his capital cities, to fall, does not look like Yahweh has power or sovereignty. And so you'll know it, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Ahab says, by whom? Who's going to help me give this into your hand? Who should I get to do this? And he says that the young man who served as the district governor, so within the kingdom of Israel, these district governors, and he says, okay, who's going to start this show? Who's going to start the battle? And he says, you. Now, it is not normal that you would think a city under siege would be the initiators or go on the offensive, but he's due. And so he musters the young men in verse 15 of chapter 20 who served the district governors, 232 of them, and then he mustered all the people of Israel. Look at there, 7,000, similar to the ones that have been mustered for Elijah, if you will. They went out there at noon, and these guys are drunk. Ben-Hadad had been drinking himself in the booze, also with the 32 kings allied with him. Now, that's an enormous number of kings. Let's understand that for the most part, kings in that day and time were kings over city-states, not kings over entire empires like we might envision a king of England or the king of Persia or even the king or even Macedonian kings like Alexander III. They are mostly city-state or local area kings. And so 32, though, is a large number of people to be allied with this guy. So he's got a lot of forces, and they're serving as allies to him. And so Ben-Hadad sent out scouts. They've come from Samaria. And he says something very odd. He says, if they've come for peace, take them alive. If they've come out for war, take them alive. Don't kill them. One way or the other, he's not supposed to kill them. I don't have a great deal of understanding about why exactly he says that, other than perhaps he wants to maybe capture their leadership and take them in and perhaps quiz them. However, it doesn't work out good for him. Each one of these guys kills Arameans. They fly. They flee away. Israel pursues them. But the king, Ben-Hadad of Aram, he escapes on a horse with the cavalry. And so the king of Israel went out, I'm assuming that's Ahab, attacked the horses and chariots, and defeated the Arameans with a great slaughter. And so the prophet approached the king. This is the same prophet. Come and strengthen yourself and consider well what you have done. For in the spring the king of Aram will come up against you. We have talked about this also. This is not necessarily a time of professional armies. He's got to go back. He's lost a lot of men, so he's lost a lot of people that would be working his fields and working the shops of Damascus and taking care of things there. And so he's got to muster up some more people and go back. He's got to rally perhaps these 32 kings that have also suffered defeat and bring in mercenaries or other allies to do that. But the prophet says he's coming back again. And then the servants, the king of Aram, come to him and they say something very interesting to Ben-Hadad. Their gods are the gods of the hills, so they were stronger than we were. So let's go fight them on the plain, because surely we will be stronger than them. And so we see this concept of deities being over geographical areas. The God of the hills, the God of the valleys, the God of the rivers, this same type of nature of thing there. And so we'll muster an army. We think about it. If you do have horses and chariots, they are not very, very helpful in war in mountainous areas. You are better off to have plains where chariots and horse groups can maneuver more effectively, surround people, flank people, and chariots just really don't work in the mountains. I haven't been to Jerusalem. I know people like Don have been to Jerusalem. You just don't fight in chariots on the side of mountains. And so in the spring, just as has been prophesied, Ben-Hadad musters the Arameans, and he goes up to Aphek to fight that way. And so these people, the man of God later on tells, Yahweh is not pleased that the Arameans have said, oh, he's just a God of the mountains, he's not a God of the valleys. And the prophet says, that has stirred up the Lord. And the Lord has said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to show them I'm God of everything. Let them believe that, that's perfectly fine. But this has irritated Yahweh, and he is going to make an example, and then they will know that I am the Lord. He's already told Ahab, I'm going to show you victory, and you'll know that I am Yahweh. And then he says to them, then they're going to know that I'm Yahweh. So this complete dominance, complete sovereignty of God. God is sovereign over the Arameans. He is sovereign over Israel and everything, and the mountains and the valleys and the plains and the oceans and the rivers, whatever you want to name this being the king. And it makes us think about Yahweh picking the lesser evil. He picks Ahab to back here, but not because I think Ahab is a righteous, godly man, but because Ahab, whether he is a nasty king or not, these are still God's people, and their God does not need to be defeated and shown in defeat. For ancient people, if I defeat you and I tear down and burn down your temple or whatnot, I have defeated your God. I have taken his city and I have defeated him, and that just doesn't need to be the case. So I don't think God chooses any evil. I think God chooses for his people to be victorious, even though their leadership is lousy. So we see that Samaria is the lower area, Aphek up towards the border, towards Damascus and Syria, where the Arameans are coming from, is where the battle is going to take place. So we're more like up in a river valley around Aphek. And so thinking about he lets Ben-Hadad live. So this battle takes place. The Israelites kill 100,000 Aramean foot soldiers in one day. Verse 29 tells us the rest of them fled into the city. One would assume the battle took place out on the hinterlands, the surrounding area of Aphek, and they've run to refuge inside the city, and the wall fell on 27,000 that were left. I don't know who cleaned up all these bodies. This is a lot to do, and a lot of people died. The birds feasted well, I guess. Ben-Hadad is hiding out in the city. His servants say, hey, look, we're going to put on sackcloth, and we're going to put waist around our waist and ropes on our heads, and go to the king of Israel, and perhaps, because we've heard he's merciful, maybe he'll spare your life. I would never let the king live of my enemies. The very first person I kill is the king. If I am fighting in the war of the American Revolution, the first people I'm going to shoot, if I'm the British, are the American people that are on horseback, because that is the leadership, and everybody else will scatter. I would never let your king live in doing that. But Ahab does that, and it doesn't really make God very excited. And so, but Ben-Hadad comes to him, and Ahab, I kept wanting to say Arab, but he's not Arab. Ahab allows him to live because Ben-Hadad makes a treaty with him. He says, I'll restore the towns that my father took from your father, and you may establish bazaars or market for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. So, hey, well, let's make a trade. I'll allow you to have an economic presence in Damascus. I'm going to give you back these border cities, and if you're happy with that, let me live. Now, I don't know that Ahab couldn't have done that on his own, but he does agree to do that, and maybe he does show some mercy in that way. But we have this weird situation here where he lets him live. And I think he let Ben-Hadad live because of this economic advantage that he has there, and he can conquer over him. But why would you let your enemy survive? I would kill Ben-Hadad and take those cities and march myself into Damascus just the same. And you have eliminated a gigantic number of their military forces here anyway. So we have this very weird situation where a certain prophet goes up to another prophet and he says, strike me. And the guy says, I'm not going to do that. He says, okay, because you haven't done what the Lord says, a lion's going to eat you, and a lion eats you. We have lions frequently eating people that don't behave, the prophets, in the books of the Kings. He goes up to another, and the guy says, okay, I'll whack you in the side of the head, and I'll do whatever you say. You asked for it. And it brings on a fake injury that makes him look like he has a war injury. And the king is passing by him, and he cries out to him and says, hey, your servant here was, this is a charade. Your servant was in battle. I captured somebody from the enemy and in thick of battle, and he brought him in. He says, guard this man with your life. If he's missing, your life shall be given for his, or you shall pay a talent of silver. Now, that's an unimaginable sum for a foot soldier to pay, is roughly 75 pounds of silver. He says, and so, while I wasn't paying attention, essentially the guy escaped. And so Ahab says, well, you got what's coming to you. And he rips off this thing on his hand and says, I'm going to tell you, then he quickly took the bandage from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. So whoever this guy is, at least Ahab recognizes them as a prophet. It's also very neat that you don't see Ahab's name used very often in this entire passage. It just refers to him as the king of Israel. And he says to them, thus says the Lord, because you have let the man go whom I have devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And the king of Israel set out, restful and sullen, and he came to Samaria. This sounds like Ahab at the beginning of chapter 19 when it goes back there. One of the things that's important for us to take away, we've just got a couple of minutes left here in class, you will often see this phrase, maybe rendered other ways. This is really one word in Hebrew. It's herem. It's hard to say that. I have to muster up some sinus drainage to be able to pronounce Hebrew correctly. But it's one of the things my Hebrew professor said. He goes, you got to have a runny nose to be able to pronounce Hebrew words correctly. But we see this devoted to destruction. It's something that has been devoted to destruction by God, whether it's the Canaanite people or it's some particular thing or it's the city of Jericho. And we think about, you're not going to take anything out of this city. We're going to destroy Ai, and it's going to be wiped out. And don't take nothing from it. It is all devoted to God and destruction. And then somebody takes things home from there and brings about trouble. So you will see this phrase often, but it really just means things that are set aside that God said will be destroyed. And he should have killed the king of Syria and completely defeated them, not allow them to be around, as you see if you go on and read in the book of 2 Kings, to continue to be a thorn in the side of Israel, and to some extent a thorn in the side of Judah. And so that's when you see this said, that's typically the translation of one Hebrew word, something that's given over to God to be completely destroyed. And so we learn here, and in our concluding class next week, spoiler alert, Ahab dies. That's kind of the conclusion of it. It's a good place that they divided 1st and 2nd Kings. Remember, 1st and 2nd Kings wasn't divided originally as we go through it. So for next week, it will be our last class. Craig will be in here for the winter quarter. I can't remember exactly what he said he's going to teach on, but please read 21 and 22 to prepare yourselves for next week. I know I didn't give a lot of chance for anybody to speak in here today, and I apologize for that. I will try to do that, but we had a lot of territory to cover. I know that the story of Naboth is familiar to many of you, but there's some very interesting things to look at, like about the ancestral inheritance, things like that, that will be very important for us to understand, because I want you to understand the historical and theological context that we look at when we see these stories about the people of Israel. You got 15 seconds. Anybody got anything monumental to say? Okay. Well, you can leave early if you want to. I'm going to give you all a whole 5 seconds early to leave class. Remember to read your